The secrets of the madman's farm. A small town in Wisconsin was living peacefully until a local woman went missing. No one could have imagined that something would be hiding behind the door of an old farmhouse that would shake the world to its core. What the police found inside would forever change the meaning of the word horror. Ed Gein was born on August 27, 1906 in the city of La Crosse, Wisconsin. However, when Ed was 8 years old, his family moved. The main reason for the move was that Ed's mother, Augusta, was a very devout woman. She believed that La Crosse was a hotbed of sinful living, and she didn't want Edie and his older brother Henry to grow up in that city. It is not surprising that a remote small town called Plainfield was chosen for the move, with a population of no more than 1,000 people. But even with the isolation of this town, the Gein family did not live in the city. Instead, they purchased a remote house on a farm about 5 kilometers from the town. Edie and his brother rarely left the farm, and they lived in isolation from the outside world. Ed's mother discouraged any attempts he made to make friends, constantly finding new reasons why Ed shouldn't associate with his schoolmates. Ed's relationship with his father, George, was also strained. George was an alcoholic and often used physical force against his sons. On April 1, 1940, when Ed was 34 years old, his father, who had been suffering from pneumonia, died at the age of 66 due to a heart attack. After this, in order to cover their living expenses, Ed and his brother Henry began to spend more time outside the farm, in the city. There they relied on various odd jobs to make ends meet. Ed often worked as a babysitter for neighboring children. On May 16, 1944, Ed's brother passed away due to a heart attack. Augusta was deeply affected by the loss of her eldest son. Shortly after his death, she suffered a stroke and was confined to bed. Ed took care of her around the clock and even spent some nights in her bed. In 1945, Augusta recovered from her illness, but soon suffered another attack that further weakened her condition. And on December 20th of the same year, she passed away at the age of 67. The death of his mother was a turning point in Ed's life. He had spent his entire life under his mother's protection. She had completely shaped his actions. However, now she was gone. He had never lived independently before, and by the time of his mother's death, he was still a child in the body of a 40-year-old man. For the residents of the town, Edward was a man who was always willing to help others with their affairs for a small fee. He was friendly and strange, but his strangeness did not cause anyone to be alarmed. On November 16, 1957, deer hunting season began in Plainfield. As a result, most of the town's men were in the woods. On this day, Edward Gein left his secluded farm and headed to the town's warden's general store. At the time, the store was owned by a 57-year-old woman named Bernice Warden. As a rule, she also worked behind the counter. A few weeks before this day, Ed had visited this store. He didn't buy anything, but he tried to engage in conversation with Bernice. However, she wasn't interested, and Ed began to cause her some concern. On the morning of November 16th, Ed visited Bernice again. He purchased a canister of antifreeze from her, then carried it to his car and returned to the store. He asked Bernice to show him the rifle that was hanging near the window, and when she turned her back, Ed shot her in the back of the head. He knew that hunting season had begun, and his shot would not attract much attention, as there were many other gunshots that day. He loaded Bernice's body into his car and took it back to his farm. It was only 6 hours after the incident. Bernice's son Frank returned from hunting and found the store empty. He was very surprised about this since the door was not locked, but soon he saw a huge puddle of Crocs on the floor near the window, and his surprise was replaced by wild horror. The man immediately went to the police, and Edward Gein immediately became the #1 suspect on the police list. There were 2 things that indicated his involvement in Bernice's disappearance. The first being that he had been visiting the store too often in recent days, which had been a bit of a concern for Bernice, who shared this with her son. But the most important thing is that the last item listed in Bernice's notebook was a can of antifreeze that she had sold to Ed Gein. The police found Ed having dinner in a nearby house and arrested him, taking him to the station. At the same time, a second group of police officers went to the Gaines farm in search of Bernice. The house was closed, so the police decided to check the unlocked buildings on the farm. One of these was the so-called summer kitchen. The farm did not have electricity. Therefore, there was absolute darkness inside the building. The only source of light was the flashlights in the hands of the police officers. As they explored the building, they noticed what appeared to be a butchered deer carcass hanging from the ceiling by its legs. But upon closer inspection, they were horrified to realize that it was the disemboweled body of Bernice Warden. Crime was rare in Plainfield, so it was no surprise that the local police, who were unskilled in such matters, were shocked. But this was only the beginning. After breaking down the door of the house, the police found that the house was full of various kinds of garbage. Only the room of Ed's mother, Augusta, was clean. But the mountains of garbage were the most harmless thing in the house. Human skin masks were hung on the walls. A whole wardrobe made from human skin was found. 2 pairs of pants, a waistcoat, a soup plate made from a skull, and a human skin chair. The house contained almost every household item made from human remains. However, the most shocking discovery was a chest containing 12 female heads. In the first 24 hours of his detention, Ed didn't say a word, just remained silent. Later, he expressed a desire for an apple pie. The officers realized that although he was a 50-year-old adult, he was thinking like a child, and they adjusted their approach to his interrogation. They fulfilled his request, thus showing some kindness towards him. In return, Ed told the police what they wanted to know about the items found in his house. After his mother's death, Ed was completely lost. Left all alone, he began reading books on anatomy, stories about the atrocities committed by the Nazis during World War II, and various information about exhumations, which quickly ignited his imagination. 2 years after his mother's death, Gein began visiting the cemetery where she was buried. He would dig up the graves and remove parts of the human bodies. In a way, he was trying to resurrect his mother, as he was incredibly dependent on her. At night, he would put on pants, a shirt, and a woman's leather mask and walk around the farm, pretending to be Augusta, Ed's deceased mother. The police checked the graves that Eduardi had mentioned, and they found that the coffins were broken. But there was still one mystery in his story. 12 female heads were found in his house. 2 of them belonged to the victims of Gein. 9 he had dug up in a cemetery. The identity of the remaining 12th woman was never established. Gein was accused of the murders. However, he did not go to prison because he was declared insane and was sent to a mental hospital for criminals. He spent 11 years there, and in 1968, the doctors decided that Gein was sane enough to stand trial again. However, the judge found Gein to be insane this time. Ed spent the rest of his life in the hospital, where he died on July 26, 1984, from a heart attack caused by cancer. He was buried in the Plainfield City Cemetery, next to his parents and brother. This man has become a cult prototype for most horror movies. For example, the movie Texas Chainsaw Massacre, 1974, used a large number of elements from the story of Edward Gein.